Postmodern Condition by Jean-François Lyotard. 7. The Pragmatics of Scientific Knowledge. Let us attempt to characterize, if only in summary fashion, the classical conception of the pragmatics of scientific knowledge. In the process, we will distinguish between the research game and the teaching game. Copernicus states that the path of the planets is circular. Whether this proposition is true or false, it carries within it a set of tensions, all of which affect each of the pragmatic posts it brings into play. Sender, addressee, and referent. These tensions are classes of prescriptions which regulate the admissibility of the statement as scientific. First, the sender should speak the truth about the referent, the path of the planets. What does this mean? That on the one hand, he is supposed to be able to provide proof of what he says, and on the other hand, he is supposed to be able to refute any opposing or contradictory statements concerning the same referent. Second, it should be possible for the addressee validly to give or refuse his assent to the statement he hears. This implies that he is himself a potential sender, since when he formulates his agreement or disagreement, he will be subject to the same double requirement or proof or refutation that Copernicus was. He is therefore supposed to have potentially the same qualities as Copernicus. He is his equal. But this will only become known when he speaks and under the above conditions. Before that, it will be impossible to say whether or not he is a scientific scholar. Third, the referent of which Copernicus speaks is supposed to be expressed by his statement in conformity with what it actually is. But since what it is can only be known through statements of the same order as that of Copernicus, the rule of adequation becomes problematical. What I say is true because I prove that it is, but what proof is there that my proof is true? The scientific solution of this difficulty consists in the observance of two rules. The first of these is dialectical or even rhetorical in the forensic sense. A referent is that which is susceptible to proof and can be used as evidence in a debate. Not I can prove something because reality is the way I say it is. But as long as I can produce proof, it is permissible to think that reality is the way I say it is. The second rule is metaphysical. The same referent cannot supply a plurality of contradictory or inconsistent proofs. Or, stated differently, God is not deceptive. These two rules underlie what 19th century science calls verification and 20th century science falsification. They allow a horizon of consensus to be brought to the debate between partners. Not every consensus is a sign of truth, but it is presumed that the truth of a statement necessarily draws a consensus. That covers research. It should be evident that research appeals to teaching as its necessary complement. The scientist needs an addressee, who can in turn become the sender. He needs a partner. Otherwise, the verification of his statements would be impossible, since the non-renewal of the requisite skills would eventually bring an end to the necessary contradictory debate. Not only the truth of a scientist's statement, but also his competence, is at stake in that debate. One's competence is never an accomplished fact. It depends on whether or not the statement proposed is considered by one's peers to be worth discussion in a sequence of argumentation and refutation. The truth of the statement and the competence of its sender are thus subject to the collective approval of a group of persons who are competent on an equal basis. Equals are needed and must be created. Didactics is what ensures that this reproduction takes place. It is different from the dialectical game of research. Briefly, its first presupposition is that the addressee, the student, does not know what the sender knows. Obviously, that is why he has something to learn. Its second presupposition is that the student can learn what the sender knows and become an expert whose competence is equal to that of his master. This double requirement supposes a third, that there are statements for which the exchange of arguments and the production of proof, constituting the pragmatics of research, are considered to have been sufficient, and which can therefore be transmitted through teaching as they stand, in the guise of indisputable truths. In other words, you teach what you know, such is the expert. But as the student improves their skills, the expert can confide to them what they do not know, but are trying to learn. In this way, the student is introduced to the dialectics of research, or the game of producing scientific knowledge. If we compare the pragmatics of science to that of narrative knowledge, we note the following properties. 1. Scientific knowledge requires that one language game, denotation, be retained, and all others excluded. A statement's truth value is the criterion determining its acceptability. Of course, we find other classes of statements, such as interrogatives and prescriptives, but they are only present as turning points in the dialectical argumentation, which must end in a denotative statement. In this context, then, one is learned if one can produce a true statement about a referent, and one is a scientist if one can produce verifiable or falsifiable statements about reference accessible to the experts. 2. Scientific knowledge is in this way set apart from the language games that combine to form the social bond. Unlike narrative knowledge, it is no longer a direct and shared component of the bond, but it is indirectly a component of it, because it develops into a profession and gives rise to institutions. And in modern societies, language games consolidate themselves in the form of institutions run by qualified partners. The relation between knowledge and society becomes one of mutual exteriority. A new problem appears, that of the relationship between the scientific institution and society. Can this problem be solved by didactics, for example, by the premise that any social atom can acquire scientific competence? 3. Within the bounds of the game of research, the competence required concerns the post of sender alone. There's no particular competence required of the addressee, and there is no competence required of the referent. Even in the case of the human sciences, where it is an aspect of human conduct, the referent is in principle external to the partners engaged in scientific dialectics. Here, in contrast to the narrative game, a person does not have to know how to be what knowledge says they are. 4. A statement of science gains no validity from the fact of being reported. Even in the case of pedagogy, it is taught only if it is still verifiable in the present through argumentation and proof. In itself, it is never secure from falsification. The knowledge that has accumulated in the form of already accepted statements can always be challenged. But conversely, any new statement that contradicts a previously approved statement regarding the same referent can be accepted as valid only if it refutes the previous statement by producing arguments and proofs. 5. The game of science thus implies a diachronic temporality, that is, a memory and a project. The current sender of a scientific statement is supposed to be acquainted with previous statements concerning its referent and only proposes a new statement on the subject if it differs from the previous ones. Here, what I have called the accent of each performance, and by that token, the polemical function of the game, takes precedence over the meter. This diachrony, which assumes memory and a search for the new, represents in principle a cumulative process. Its rhythm, or the relationship between accent and meter, is variable. These properties are well known, but they are worth recalling for two reasons. First, drawing a parallel between science and non-scientific knowledge helps us understand, or at least sense, that the former's existence is no more, and no less, necessary than the latter's. Both are composed of sets of statements. The statements are moves, made by the players within the framework of generally applicable rules. These rules are specific to each particular kind of knowledge, and the moves, judged to be good in one, cannot be of the same type as those judged good in another, unless it happens that way by chance. It is therefore impossible to judge the existence or validity of narrative knowledge on the basis of scientific knowledge and vice versa. The relevant criteria are different. All we can do simple is gaze in wonderment at the diversity of discursive species, just as we do at the diversity of plant or animal species. Lamenting the loss of meaning in postmodernity boils down to mourning the fact that knowledge is no longer principally narrative. Such a reaction does not necessarily follow. Neither does an attempt to derive or engender scientific knowledge from narrative knowledge, as if the former contained the latter in an embryonic state. Nevertheless, language species, like living species, are interrelated and their relations are far from harmonious. The second point justifying this quick reminder on the properties of the language game of science concerns precisely its relation to narrative knowledge. I have said that narrative knowledge does not give priority to the question of its own legitimation, and that it certifies itself in the pragmatics of its own transmission, without having recourse to argumentation and proof. This is why its incomprehension of the problems of scientific discourse is accompanied by a certain tolerance. It approaches such discourse primarily as a variant in the family of narrative cultures. The opposite is not true. The scientist questions the validity of narrative statements and concludes that they are never subject to argumentation or proof. They classify them as belonging to a different mentality. Savage, primitive, underdeveloped, backward, alienated, composed of opinions, customs, authority, prejudice, ignorance, ideology. Narratives are fables, myths, legends, fit only for women and children. At best, attempts are made to throw some rays of light into this obscurantism, to civilize, educate, develop. This unequal relationship is an intrinsic effect of the rules specific to each game. We all know its symptoms. It is the entire history of cultural imperialism from the dawn of Western civilization. It is important to recognize its special tenor, which sets it apart from all other forms of imperialism. It is governed by the demand for legitimation.